So tonight would be kind of the building of my own essay, if I were to write one, on how to respond to all of this. And I really think, cultural studies are important, for us to understand what culture is, how it develops, and what's a good response to it. So we'll see what happens here. All right. Peter Crayf, the philosopher emeritus from Boston University, talks a bit about if you don't realize there's a culture war on, then you must have been on vacation in the moon. Okay? We're in the midst of battles. I was reading just, I guess it was the other week, although the article is from November of last year, Religions in America workshop, and they were talking about culture and cultural wars. So they gave 3 different opinions. I just thought I'd share because it was just timely. So Rod Dreyer is a senior editor at the Imaginative Conservative. He's got a whole story on how he went from being a Methodist, nominal Methodist, to a Roman Catholic to an Orthodox. But he declares in his book the Benedict option, Saint Benedict, that the cultural war is pretty much over. In other words, the social religious conservatives have been defeated, and Obergefell, the marriage equality, so-called Equality Act that went through, he said that was the death knell for Christians in the United States. So he sort of says it's over. Now what do we do? Well, the Benedict option is his book that he promotes on how we have to not leave, the culture, but we need safe places to regroup as we go back out into the world, almost like how Benedict did into the desert. And then Gorski, he says, really we have these warring dichotomies and they polarize us. So he kind of says that's also over. In other words, everything's so polarized in our country that it doesn't really represent any of us. So how do we fight in this, right? But just little lead-ins. And then Hartman. He really doesn't go one way or the other per se saying that we've won or lost. He believes that we've lost, but not because it's gone, liberal or ultra-conservative like fascism, but that we've been defeated at the hands of capitalism. So consumerism has consumed us, and that itself has torn it. So these are just interesting tidbits. In other words, this is an issue that goes way beyond Catholics and way beyond Christians as to what are we going to do with the culture in our country. We're talking here in the United States, of course. So we're not alone in this. But we're going to have to ask questions like, if it's a war and we want to win the war, what does winning look like? Well, I don't know. Maybe we should keep in mind that, one, we're not the ones that are really doing the battle. We forget that sometimes, that this is the work of the Spirit. When I first got involved in ecumenical work 15 years ago, a good Redemptorist priest friend of mine said, never forget, ecumenism is the work of the Spirit, not you. As simple as that was, it was profound to me. So, you do your best and you make as much effort as you can, but you realize that I'm not the impetus behind this. There's something else that's working behind this, and I have to find out, how do I play into this? So we're going to have to say, what does winning look like? Well, let's just be honest. All we can really do is secure our own salvation. It's hard enough for us to work that out in fear and trembling. It's hard enough for us to become virtuous and moral people. So that's going to give us a hint on what winning looks like, is that we've overcome ourselves. We have won that battle to begin with, and then we'll move out from there. We're not neo-Marxists, where we are looking for particular programs and social ideologies that will shape us and help fix, and heal things in our culture. We want to do that just from the family out. So we'll have to look in the end, what does that mean? Who are our enemies? This is Peter Crayf's input. If we think that the people who don't share our belief system,
Sorry.
that's okay. I didn't swear again, did I, sister?
She did.
She died.
No, Billy just made a joke.
Well, share it, Billy.
He
Share
said,
the joke, Billy.
who are our enemies? I said, hearing people.
Who are
Hearing people.
The hearing people.
In a deaf perspective.
Now we hear what he's saying. You know, it's like when I do marriage prep, I always tell the couples, it's hard to remember, but when Satan tries to divide you two, you're not each other's enemy. If you can get to that point, and it's not always easy in the heat of the moment, you're going to realize there's an outside force trying to divide you. And immediately that joins you in opposition to the outside force. So we've got to start thinking in terms of that. Peter Crave says our enemies are not our political adversaries. They're not the Protestants. They're not the atheists. They're not the, you name it. Our enemies are demons. Now, that may not sound very intellectual to somebody. Sorry, we're spiritual people. So our enemies are demons, and Satan is the great divider. That's all he does. My friend that was going to come tonight and couldn't, I asked him, how do you struggle? Like in the ecumenical group that we're in, there's only a few of us that are liturgical. All the rest are Anabaptists, evangelical, Church of the Brethren, which has that bent. And it's very difficult to have conversations, especially when a lot of them have no formal education. They were drawn out of the congregation. So, not that that really matters, but it's hard to have conversations sometimes. And he said he struggled with it when he first joined 10 years ago. He said, I left for a while until I realized these people are advocates for what is a genuine marriage between a man and a woman. They're advocates that life begins at fertilization. At some point, he said, I have to join forces with these people. And I thought, that's pretty good. I said, I'm going to take that to heart, you know. So we've got to identify what is it going to look like when we win. Well, the winning for us, and it's a bad term, right, but is that we save ourselves, that we change who we are, and that hopefully that in turn will bleed out into our families. I mean, we'll talk in the end about how we have to live radically. Well, my friend Jeff again said, wouldn't it be great if they said, look at those Christians. They stay married forever. You know, I mean, albeit, you know, situations, you know, that arise, but he said, wouldn't it be nice if we had that reputation? We don't. You can't tell us from the rest of the world. You know, so anyway.
Can I-
Yeah, sure.
So I met a friend from college who I haven't seen in a long time over the weekend, and she was arguing, she's very much a liberal. She's liberal-minded, and she was just saying, and she was just talking about abortion, and she was saying, so if we have, and I didn't know what to, like, really didn't go down the route too much, but I changed the subject, really, what it came down to. But she said, so what I don't see is what problem, if you say that life begins at conception, then how come any time that a woman has a miscarriage, there's no funeral and there's no, and I'm like,
Well, if the child's farther along in term, there is. I mean, it's available to you. If it's not...
If it's not, but that's what I mean, that was her point, like the early on, you know, the very
Yeah.
early on miscarriages that we have sponge. And I said, that's a very good point, that is a very good point, and we should be doing that, but that's...
If it's available to us, like in other words, there may be instances where it was not available.
That's what I said, yeah.
But that is a good point. But I've had, you know, friends who've had miscarriages even, you know, maybe a little more developed, like 4 or 5 months, and they've had funeral masses said, and they have tombstones or crypts, you know. So, but it's a good point, you know. But then, you know, not to come back, but the comeback was, well, what if we did? I mean, you know, we believe it. Maybe, you know, there's reasons, but that's a good point. It's a good point. Well, anyway, let's not forget what Paul says in Ephesians. We're not against flesh and blood. What we are against are principalities, powers, world rulers, spiritual hosts of wickedness. You know, these are enemies. And it never sounds intellectual when you're having a discussion, but sorry, you know.
And just another thing about
Sure.
Peter Creek, I actually went to one of his lectures
Oh,
once.
did you? Good.
And he opened it up with, I think one of the main reasons that the 20-somethings and the teens are leaving the church is because of sex, premarital sex.
Yeah.
That's the main reason. So, because they can't reconcile acts, they can't reconcile.
Well, they know of no other expression of love. In
Yeah.
other words, I love you, it should be expressed like this, you know, which isn't going to help you in marriage. You know. He's right. All right, so this is from Archbishop Chaput. I won't read through the whole thing, but if we're in a postmodern, post-Christian time, let's not think that we are so unique. These times, he's saying, maybe St. Paul would find them equally challenging. I know a friend who's a presidential historian and said our last election, as remarkable it was for us, said it wasn't that remarkable in the history of presidential elections. It is in our time, you know, so if we don't know our history, even here, we think that somehow this is the worst of times. So anyway, we have a duty not just to penetrate and engage, but convert to Jesus Christ. And that work belongs to all of us, clergy, laity, religious. So we're all missionaries. And we can't forget that's our primary vocation in the world. Some of this I'll kick over real quick. You know, I'm big for defining terms, so what is culture? Okay, there's going to be varying definitions on this. Here's one from Berzer, where he says it's something based on kinship or banded together for common worship. So he says that the word cult, by the way, is following. So when you hear things like the cult of Mary, you know, we don't worship Mary, right? It's the following of Mary. Now in the modern term, it still means following, but because it's the following of a cult leader, now we associate cult with some wackos in Waco. That worked out. So they are putting cultus and worship together, saying that, you know, this is the origin of it, and there's a cooperation there. Cardinal Biffy, he gives actually 3 definitions, and you could see where these all show up somewhere. So it could mean from the word agriculture, where we cultivate. He said that's one meaning of it. It could be really any collective system of evaluating actions. And we all have a scale of values that we adopt when we're part of that particular culture, which is why we could talk about different types of culture, you know, Marxist culture, idealist culture. He says, you know, because we have the shared ideologies. And then we also use it sometimes in terms of our own races or ethnicities, right? So you'll have, he writes here, African culture, rural culture, there could be Italian culture, you name it, right? That's right.
What did you say?
Italian polka. He was talking about
Italian polka.
He was talking about it.
Now, T.S. Elliott, the American novelist who died at 65, he wrote a book, Notes Towards a Definition of Culture, so it's worth taking a peek at. He makes the case that no culture can appear except in relation to religion. In other words, they're so connected that even though we might talk about a religious culture, we can't talk about a culture without talking about the religion that sort of gave it its birth. He says, but 2 errors may arise. Even once the religion's gone, like if we're in a secular, you know, environment. He says, you know, the preservation and maintenance of religion, how does he say it? Let's just put it this way. There's like that residual effect that can be left over, all right? So it can, for some time, exist in the absence of a particular religion, even though it's connected to that. I get it. And then there's the second one's there. The preservation and maintenance of religion need not reckon with the preservation and maintenance of culture. So he's trying to say basically that it could be residual effect, and they may not always be acting in concert with each other. I think that's how I would interpret Elliott. Now, from a doctrinal note, and that's the name of the document, some questions regarding participation of Catholics in political life. It says, faith in Jesus Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life, right, calls Christians to exert a greater effort in building a culture which, if it's inspired by the gospel, will reclaim the values and contents of the Catholic tradition. I mean, you really can't separate Western culture from Christendom. I mean, they're pretty much synonymous. So if a lot of things are an attack of Western culture, let's be clear that it's an attack on Christendom. Now, Benedict XVI in Caritas in Veritas, he talks about this eclecticism where maybe we have little bits and parts of various cultures, or he also talks about cultural leveling. I think what he means by that is that those cultures, it's an assimilation. I would think that's an assimilation. He says they have in common the separation of culture from human nature. So cultures can no longer define themselves within a nature that transcends them. And man ends up being reduced to mere cultural statistic. So you're going to see, like, the Catholic Church is going to be very deep and bound to the anthropological understanding of the human person to culture. If you don't understand who the human person is, culture is going to go awry, because culture is there to serve man. We can use that with the Sabbath, right? Man is not made for the Sabbath is made for man. Well, man is not made for culture. Culture comes from us. If you don't understand who man is, then you're going to be tongue-tied trying to figure out what the role of culture is in the world. And it's going to be a dominant. I mean, we'll see that in a little bit. The dominant and powerful culture will always win. Something we should always keep in mind when we're evangelizing with somebody is that, you know, when you attack a point that they disagree with, oftentimes they've internalized that to the point where they see you attacking them, right? So not everybody can argue indifferently. Some people take everything to heart. So if somebody, you know, has adapted part of what they believe or think to their identity, and you're attacking what they believe or think, they think you're attacking their identity, and that's where the heels get dug in, okay? So here, a cultural identity is that each person within this identity, they build a sense of solidarity with others who share that cultural identity. It may not be monolithic. So a good friend of mine who was a lesbian activist would talk about her sisters. I mean, this became an identity, and it became a way for her to look at herself in sense of solidarity. So even when I had said, have you personally ever been, not to say that gays and lesbians have not been discriminated against, have you ever not been able to buy food at a particular store? No. Have you ever not gotten a particular job? No. Have you ever been asked to leave a particular establishment? Well, I went down the line. She goes, no. I said, okay. I said, well, then that doesn't diminish the discrimination that happens within the community, but you're going to have to keep clear that, yes, you're in solidarity with them, but you can't internalize that. I mean, because that's part of the story of overcoming this, right? That you have to keep that in mind. So Berzer talks about culture being like an artificial product, in a sense that we make it. It's an artifact. It's not something that grows out of the ground. So we build it up through successive generations. But, he said, it's not a jungle that grew up spontaneously by blind pressures of natural forces. What I take from that is this came from somewhere. It didn't fall out of the heavens. It was built and developed because of the way that people interacted with each other and with their culture, which means we could, you know, reverse engineer that and go in the opposite direction. In other words, the bottom line is we can affect the culture that we live in. Maybe not in a way that we would like. Maybe the best we can do, and it may be the thing we have to do, is to make sure that our families and our marriages are intact, and our families are loved, and our kids are loved. You know, let's just have, was it Pope Francis, you'll have to watch it, if I can think of putting the link up, he said, we need a revolution of one. And what was the point? It was beautiful. Does anybody remember? It was a TED Talk. Pope Francis I was asked to give a TED Talk, and it was based on the revolution of one, but it was just beautiful. But it was basically like, just you do it. Don't worry about what anybody else can do. It'll come to me. Now, secularization. You know, we're becoming secularized. There's many books that have been written. Secularization is really a myth. Secularization may sound as though they have, you know, jettisoned all sorts of values that were based on Judeo-Christian understanding of values, but it's really not true. They've just kind of like almost adopted them in some way. So the French Revolution, it infected the world with ideology, but it was really a pseudo-religion. If you've ever studied Maximilien Robespierre, all he did was take, you know, the cathedral of the Catholic Church, dismantle it in his mind, and put up, what was the word that they used? Let me see. The cult of the supreme being. So this was the beginning of the great deist. So if you go from a personal God to an impersonal God, it's not going to be too long before you have a non-person God. And then what happens? Well, then an ideology has to take its place. This is something I threw in there because I thought it was interesting. This is psychology, and to be honest, it's not, you know, the hard, cut and dry, hard science. And there's people that disagree with some of this, but I thought it was intriguing, so I thought I wanted to include part of it. When you have, you know, dominant and non-dominant groups within a culture, in other words, a minority and majority, if we want to speak of it in that way, how does the minority group act in amongst the majority? Okay, so this is one theory on identity development. How do people develop their identities? They start out with this unexamined stage, where they don't even realize that they, you know, are different than the majority. They just invest in the dominant group. They don't even really question the fact that, you know, I am different than them. Then they start to come into this conformity stage, so we're told, where they start to not only be indifferent to it, but they start to adopt the methods and the understanding of the majority so that they just fit in. You know, and I'm thinking of like my mom telling me about when the Italians came over and settled in our neighborhood, how this worked. In the beginning, you're sort of indifferent to the whole thing, and then at some point, like my mom would tell, you know, my nonna, you know, speak English, Mom. This is America. Speak English. You know, so you're at this point where you want to adopt so that you fit in. Then what happens is there's two more stages. The third stage is resistance and separation. You start to challenge the fact that they are making you different. And you're starting to get incensed by that to a certain degree. So then you challenge the majority. And you're doing this so that you have some sort of refuge from discrimination. And then you have ultimately integrated your minority difference status, your non-dominant status, in with your, you haven't become the dominant group, you're okay with yourself. At this point, you're okay with who you are as a person. If you have anger over how you're being mistreated as the non-dominant group, you might put it towards positive ends. I will now work to overcome, you know, direct discrimination, okay? This is one theory. But I thought about this when I was reading. I love psychology. And I thought, you know, our young people go through this because Christians are becoming the non-dominant group, right? So we're the ones that are now being threatened. It doesn't matter if we look like the majority in the United States. We really aren't, in effect, the majority. So we have these people who are just indifferent, right? Maybe growing up, they don't even recognize that, hey, the way my family sees the world is different than the way the secular world sees the world. Maybe they don't realize that. At some point, maybe they do realize, you know, why are we a little different? But I want to dress like them. I want to be like them. I don't want to go and do this. I do want to go and do that. They start to adopt certain things because they don't want to be perceived as different than the majority group. Okay? Now, up to this point, we're good. But I'm thinking if there's any validity to this, somehow we can't get them to the next stage. They get to the stage where they conform. The way that they get over these challenges from discrimination is by conforming. Now, we would be talking maybe in terms of discrimination, but we could talk in terms of perhaps they're calling us out for our particular beliefs and lifestyle. So rather than at that point, rather than starting to say, you know what, I notice a difference and I'm going to move on to the point where I feel good about this and work against it, they literally conform. But at this point, what they are resisting and separating from is from Christianity. So it's almost like a weird cycle where the non-dominant group, the Christians, are falling into the dominant group. They're actually succumbing and never quite working through this. And I thought to myself, if we could find some way, now there's always people out there, and I remember in a reading, we'll see later, they call them the evangelical Catholics, right? The people like yourselves, the people who are theology majors, or the people who are youth leaders. It's a small group, but they have found a way to move on through here. Others haven't. How do we drop them at this point? I don't know. I don't know how we get them past that conformity stage where I just want to dress like them. I think of, I had 3 daughters, the one that played volleyball. It's funny in high school, and especially Catholic schools, the outfits they wear. The guys don't. I mean, I asked the girl, lady coach, why do they wear it like that? Well, it's more aerodynamic, it's better when they're playing and everything. I said, well, that's funny. I don't notice the guys wearing these. So they must not have the same problem that the girls do. I mean, I almost want them to say, can you just say it? They look better than that? I mean, or you see like cheerleading outfits. I mean, if you've seen even at Catholic high schools, sometimes you're thinking, oh my God, right? So how do we get to the point where we don't want to be perceived different? We don't want to be the cheerleading squad that's out there with the skirts down to our knees. They're going to think we're Amish. So at this point, they have found no way to take a refuge in their faith against the discrimination. They've just conformed. But they really feel like they've made a conscious decision to live like this, not realizing they just joined the culture. I mean, you really just caved in. Yes?
It has to do largely with your age, I think. When you become a teenager, about that age, your social reference moves from your parents to your peers.
Yeah.
Those are the people whose opinions really start to matter. You don't care what mom and dad think anymore. You're going to do what friends do.
Yeah.
You remember this. I'm just getting out of this now.
Yeah.
I'm just getting out of this now.
I just went through it myself.
Exactly. So,
You're right. No, and this isn't an age-based thing, but I agree with that. I mean, I'm putting it in that context too.
it's a compounding factor, really.
It is.
Not until you start to get 20s, 30s, 40s, you're just like, why do I care what they think?
Absolutely.
I can do dumb things myself.
Absolutely. Yes.
Well, with the volleyball, because my daughter played volleyball too. And first, it's shocking.
Yeah.
When they first do it. So did you make her wear something different?
I got to tell you, she went to her coach. 3 of them did. She had one friend who was an evangelical Christian who was really spearheading it. And they asked for longer shorts. And the coach said, no, but if you want to buy them, you could. I don't know if it's still, but on Route 30 in Lancaster was a volleyball store.
Yeah.
They went down there and they bought the longer shorts.
But we conform.
Yeah.
Not just the kids are trying to wear them shorter and all, but even as parents, we are almost forced to conform to whatever
and that's
the organization is doing. So we can't really move out of that stage. We're stuck too if we want our daughter to play and continue her in there. But eventually, it doesn't sit with the person. All those things that add up and look a certain way didn't sit well with my daughter eventually, and she chose not to play any longer. So
that's interesting.
For our school team.
Yeah.
Because all of those values didn't fit with her.
I didn't put any articles up for your dialectic, but I had an article that was, I think it was the New York Times, where the women and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but the women who were for liberation in the 70s were being interviewed. And the ones that were quoted literally said, what did we do? Our daughters, we fought so hard to be liberated, and our daughters are dressing like hookers. And they said sort of what you had said in a sense, we don't have the wherewithal to have them go. In other words, either you're living vicariously through your young daughter, look how popular she is, well, she's my daughter, or, and this is just talking about girls, or, we buy them the clothes. So the woman was saying, who can I blame? I'm complaining about my daughter wearing nylon stockings and stuff that in the 70s that was a prostitute. And I think I shared with you, my middle daughter, who's in theology and philosophy, she would die if she knew I was sharing this with you. We were in Baltimore, and in the not too good section, just a little bit west of Inner Harbor, and we were coming by the Pussycat Club, and my daughter, who likes cats, said, "Oh, that's a place I'd like to go." She was only 15, My wife was shaking her head, and I said, honey, do you see that girl that's out front walking back and forth? She was probably in her late teens. Now, my daughter went to a Catholic school. I said, does she dress anything different than some of the girls like at the football games and at the dances? She goes, no, not really. Why? I said, she's a prostitute. I said, the Pussycat Club is a gentleman's, so-called gentleman's club. She goes, no. My wife's like, yes, it is, just drop it. That kind of thing. But this is where it comes from. You almost can identify the difference. And again, I'm not even saying this is a legitimate, development of identity, but it's an interesting proposal.
Well, there's two things that come to mind when you were discussing this. One, actually, what you had mentioned was this separation and individuation, which kids go through.
Yeah.
And it kind of fits that they don't really think about it and they're young. They conform when they're very young, and they kind of explore and separate, and they kind of have to kind of make their statement or individuate from the family. It's kind of pretty classic stuff. But what I was thinking when you first started to talk about this was there are like oppressed groups, and that resistance and separation stage, that's where all the anger comes out.
Yeah.
And it's because you've been sitting. It's more about repression and being,
Absolutely.
being dominated by a culture. I mean, you think of, historically the black culture. Currently gay culture.
Yeah.
that they feel that they've been repressed
And that's right. So we're using the word culture and talking about this is their identity, which is going to help us with evangelizing once you realize that if you're attacking the thing that they are forming their solidarity on, they see that as a clear attack on them.
Well, it's kind of strange, but being comfortable with other people's anger is important. I mean, it's sometimes we get intimidated by it instead of really trying to understand it.
I think you're right. I mean, I think there's something to this. I just know that there's people that think this is a little bit too maybe simplistic, but I just thought it was interesting, because we used to rely, and I know it's biblical, teach them in the ways they should go, and when they get older to return to those ways. No, they're not. I mean, that hasn't been the case, so what's happening? And the irony is, and the reason why I thought this was fascinating, is that if you talk to young people, they think they're making a conscious choice for the culture. They don't realize, no, you're almost mindless. I mean, you're just accepting it. It's almost like somebody told me once, they didn't say it exactly like this, but this was the gist of it. I'm so countercultural. I will actually go against whatever the culture is just because that's the kind of person I want to be. I don't want to be a conformist. And I said, everything you just said is a conformist. I mean, there's no more mind involved in what you just said than if you went along with this, right? I don't know.
I just wanted to share a story.
Sure.
Her daughter, when she was young, had really, really bad teeth. They were like shark's teeth. Like one was in front of the other. They were sticking out really bad. And hereditary. And she was not ever made a part of the crowd because of that. But we always accepted her and let her know she's beautiful. It's okay. And she grew up being very independent of what everybody else was doing, and she actually sought out other people who were perceived as being different from the crowd, and maybe that's what we need
Well,
to
yeah,
do.
see, that is this. She saw refuge as a challenge from the poke being made fun at, and then started directing it towards a positive end.
Yeah.
It's like, this is part of the trick. There's no answers here tonight, right?
We just let them know from the beginning that it's okay to be different.
Yes.
And embrace them and love them, and hopefully it'll turn out okay.
Absolutely. Okay, so Solzhenitsyn, his Nobel Prize lecture. We have the same old cave-age emotions, greed, envy, lack of control, hostility. They've all now seem respectable because they now are known under the guise of class struggle, racial conflict, struggle of the masses, trade union disputes, and so on. In other words, maybe we should start calling things what they are. You know, interesting. I love Solzhenitsyn. It's interesting. It has nothing to do with any of this. That Rod Dreher, I'm actually reading a book how Dante saved his life. I won't go into his little story, but again, he went from being a nominal Methodist to a Catholic. He reported for 6 years the clerical abuses in Boston and everything. It just, he admits, he goes, I had nothing behind me to hold me up. It destroyed me. And he said, so he went to the Orthodox Church for no intellectual reasons, but he's found a home there. But his love is for Benedict, who's a Western guy, Dante, devout Catholic, Aquinas. I mean, you can go on. It's interesting. You know, he has picked Western people. I felt like an irony. I was almost in my mind criticizing him until I realized almost everybody I picked are Orthodox. You know, these guys. And you'll see later, not just Solzhenitsyn, but there's another one that comes up. Okay, 2 more slides, I think. So we're going to say that beauty is going to save the world. And again, I love reading novels. So if you read the Brothers Karamazov, here's a quote from it. Beauty. I cannot endure the thought of that man of lofty mind and heart. Begins with an ideal of the Madonna and ends with the ideal of Sodom. The devil only knows what to make of it. This is a woman who might be, attracted to something as beautiful as Madonna, but then finds his way into impure thoughts. For the immense mass of mankind, beauty is found in Sodom, whereas most people find it in lust and that type of thing. The awful thing is that beauty is mysterious as well as terrible. God and the devil are fighting there, and the battlefield is the heart of man. So, could beauty be the battlegrounds upon which we are in? There's a whole other segment we could do on, modern art, and I'm not bashing modern art, but, how did we get to where we're at? It has a lot to do with our understanding of beauty. So beauty is obviously more than aesthetics. If we don't think that beauty has an ethical or religious dimension, then we've pretty much just left it into its own thing. This would be ours, its artists, from MGM, art for art's sake. We disagree with that. No, there's an end to it. It doesn't exist for its own self, any more than knowledge for its own sake. Knowledge is supposed to bring us somewhere else. Right? Well, so is art, so is beauty. So beauty has a value in itself. It's not just useful. Okay, we don't just use it to get somewhere. It does have a value in itself, but it has a dimension beyond itself. This Via Pulchritudinis, just known as the path of beauty. And if you read some Greek spirituality, it'll follow that. This is interesting. It might take a little bit for this to sink in on what he means. But he's talking about beauty, truth, and goodness. Okay, those transcendentals. We've talked about them a lot in this class. He said maybe it seems like an outworn formula. But if the crest, like if the crowns of these three, right? If the crowns of truth and goodness kind of get all intertangled, or they get crushed, or they get amputated, and they cannot reach the light, he said maybe, perhaps, the whimsical, the unpredictable branches of beauty will make their way through, and they will soar through those branches that were tangled. And they will go to that very place and perform the work of all three. In other words, I'm not saying he says this, but let me share what I think of this. We have to be careful. We always say, be careful, little eyes, what you see, be careful, little ears, what you hear. The reason is because, remember a lot of things in Thomas Aquinas when he talks about the disordering of the passions, things that get outside of reason. Once we can't bring reason to bear on something, then our passions can go wild. So in Dante's, Inferno, you have the people who were lustful forever floating around. They couldn't control themselves with a rudder in life, so contrapasso, this is your entire eternity, all right? So, like humor. Humor and music can kind of bend around our reason, and they can get into us, and we find ourselves agreeing, laughing, or concurring, and then all of a sudden stop and go, oh, wait. I remember I was talking to a group of ninth graders once, and this was probably 10 years ago, and I can't even, it was a song called Rude Boy, and I don't remember the lyrics, but it was vulgar. Rude boy, what you gonna do? And it talks about all kinds of stuff that I'm not going to repeat in this class. But it was a very catchy tune. And I have to admit, when I've heard it on the radio, it was just catchy. And a couple girls were just humming it or singing it in class, and I said, do you know what that song says? And I wasn't going to tell them. I said, you look it up. And they said, well, it's just a song. I said, no, see, that's the point. I mean, that's the power of and beauty of art. It could be terrible and mysterious, and it could bypass the senses. And you know, our senses are the gate. I'm sorry, our intellect is the gate. And if we allow that gate to be open or bypassed, things can get in there, and before we know it, now we have the wherewithal maybe to work our way out, but younger people may not, right? So anyway, this is why they're making a case for beauty. Maybe this will be the way out. Maybe beauty will save the world. Benedict XVI talked about this. It's a very common phrase. So Solzhenitsyn says, archaeologists have never found a stage of human existence where art and humanity have not had some purpose, right? Like, why do we have this gift? And we have to ask ourselves, what do we do with this? So it's always been part. I mean, the earliest cultures, we have some artifacts. Why are they making these things? Through art, we are sometimes visited dimly, briefly, by revelations such as cannot be produced by rational thinking. You know, this is why in deep, genuine love moments, and I'm not just talking romantic love, we often turn to poetry, we often turn to rhetoric, we turn to, you know, video, music, whatever. It isn't just that it's saying what I can't say, but it's almost like there has to be a more profound way to express this. And I can't do it by being rational with you. You know, in other words, you know, and again, I'm not a romantic, big R, but when I fell head over heels with my wife when I first saw her, I was not going to go up and give her the rational bullet points as to why I'm her best choice. I was a shock to her family. Boño? You know, so the reality is other things have to take that place. You know, and I'm starting to build up the idea that if we're aware of this, how could we use this? And we already do this, and we already know that profound things are beautiful. We often say that when somebody says something, it just knocks us off our heels. That was beautiful. I mean, why are we using words like that? I mean, it's already into our vocabulary. This is all from Solzhenitsyn. He said in the past few decades, mankind has become one. The concussions and inflammations of one of its parts instantaneously passed on to others. YouTube cell phone era. This is before cell phones and YouTubes. He was saying this. He was talking about magazines and newspapers. We're not united through years of mutual experience, neither through possession of a single eye, nor yet through a common native language, but surpassing all barriers through international broadcasting and print. In other words, we're all connected, but we don't have any control over how this connection is. There's nowhere that it's funneling through that can not filter it in a bad way, but put it into something that makes us unifying. He says the yardstick by which to measure those events of the world cannot be conveyed by sound waves in the newspaper columns. So if we're in a post-truth is what you hear like in the news, what do we do? How do we measure this stuff? We're being lied to on various levels.
I think what complicates it further is the brevity of what people say. It's like the attention span is,
Absolutely.
you know, so it makes it's just a saying. It's not, you can't get it.
Absolutely. And I was in a group of educators once, and they were saying that you have to, make sure that you don't put anything into anything longer than, I'm going to make it up because I can't remember, like 6 to 7 minutes, because that's their attention span, and you'll lose them. And I'm like, so what? Get a longer attention span. I mean, at some point, we didn't get that way. So are we going to always find out like what is the level at and then keep going there? Here's a good example. I have like a spring-fed pond. It's a small pond. And the muskrat, they lower the pond. Now, how does a muskrat lower a pond? They always dig at the water level. Well, if they dig at the water level and it lowers a little bit, and they dig again and it lowers a little bit, before you know it, it's like, this thing's down 2 feet, all right? Well, at what point do you just address the issue? So if young people are having a problem concentrating and staying focused, we need to find ways to embolden that. And it's part of our whole culture with, I don't know what Twitter is, but it's like so many characters. And we're in a bumper sticker mentality. So I think you're right.
And also, you have to keep your homily to 280 characters now, that's what I do.
With a good joke. So, propaganda, constraint, supposed to say scientific proof, are all useless. But fortunately, there does exist a means in a world, and the means is art. So, this is Solzhenitsyn saying there's a way out of this. Now, he's pretty much talking about literature, but we can expand this to other, various means of art. So rather than trying to make the proofs to other people, I mean, how do we, this is a totally new thing for even me to think, how do we make our faith beautiful to somebody? I don't know. I have examples at the end, I do. And this was from the article on Wolf, and then we'll take a little break. He says, I once believed the decadence of the West could only be turned around through politics, intellectual dialectic. I'm now convinced authentic renewal can only emerge out of the imaginative visions of the artist and the mystic. In other words, we need the poets and we need the mystics.
So maybe we want to draw a picture for the last
Draw a
class
picture.
instead of doing dialect.
That was pretty good. But if you think about this though, even in the Old Testament, what happened, what was like the last type of literature that came out in the Old Testament before Christ got here? It was wisdom literature. I mean, it was poetic, it was erotic. In other words, at some point, all that's said needs to be said. Now what? How do I present this now to the world? So the essence of modernity is the denial that man can know and can form to a transcendent order. Everything's here. We always have to, we're always going to be in this battle between making this world a better place and knowing that this is not our world. And I think the Catholic Church gets really unjustly criticized. I was listening to a convert from Muslim to secularism saying, you know what, I'm more worried about the here and now. That's a false dichotomy. Catholic, Caritas International is bigger than Red Cross. I mean, are you really going to say that we're only concerned about the thereafter? That wouldn't be a fair thing to level against the Catholic Church, right? So anyway, knowledge is power. As Christ descended and became man to reach in the pain and isolation of sin, so now the artist must descend into disorder to discover redemptive path towards order. Just some beautiful articles, I thought. I like this. An artist can burrow into a reigning worldview. And art tends to flourish when civilizations are in crisis. It's interesting. I was reading this, he was a Muslim from the 14th century. I can't think of his name right now, and I thought I wrote it somewhere. Oh, there, Ibn Khaldun. He was talking about how laws were necessary for the non-nomadic tribes. But the laws, people got used to complying with the laws, and they became less resilient and less courageous. The nomadics who had to, couldn't live in community and had to live with, rogues out in the desert, They always had the resilience. But he said, but the cultures flourished when people could be non-nomadic. They were able to build a culture and build social relations. And he said, and that's a good thing. But what happens is everybody's born into a particular culture, and over successive generations, it's like the first generation business owner. They're like, heels to the ground. They know all the dirty stuff. They hand it over to the next generation, and they just pray. Don't run in the ground, because they didn't have the same experience. I know my kids want no part of me and my wife's business. They said, that's too hard. It's too much work, right? So he had made the point that subsequent generations never had that initial experience, so all they rely on then is the weakness. It sounds ironic, but they rely on the laws to provide the courage for them that before they had. So they also find, just sociologically, that art tends to flourish, as you get towards the end of a particular age. Peter Crape thinks we're in that ourselves at this point, We become weak. So our minds have been trained to stress the pragmatic over the beautiful. And we see the beauty of the world is to be put in your hands on the lines that run interrupted through life and through death. There's something else there. Well, that's okay. We'll leave it at the beginning. And remember, the whole problem with us is not the 180-degree difference. It's the counterfeits. That's what we're always presented with. Anyway. Let's take a quick 5 here, and we'll come back and wrap it up.